August 30th, 1483. Château de Plessis-les-Tours. The air in the chamber is thick, heavy with the cloying scent of holy relics, incense, and the unmistakable odor of decay. It does not smell of a king's court, but of a tomb that is not yet sealed. Outside, hundreds of Scottish archers patrol the castle's perimeter, their eyes scanning the dense woods for the glint of an assassin's blade, their orders absolute: to shoot any man who approached without the king's explicit, daily changing password. Inside, past triple walls and a labyrinth of corridors, the king himself lies dying. This is not the majestic passing of a sovereign, but the terrified, frantic, last stand of a cornered animal. Louis XI, King of France, is paralyzed down one side of his body, his speech a slurring wreck, but his eyes, those dark, intelligent, endlessly suspicious eyes, dart around the room, missing nothing. He is a prisoner within his own fortress, a master of control who has lost dominion over his own limbs. Yet, from this squalid deathbed, he governs. Couriers come and go, trembling as they receive his guttural commands, directives that will shift trade routes, dispatch armies, and ruin noble houses hundreds of miles away. He spends a fortune on sacred artifacts, bringing the holy ampulla from Rheims, hoping to anoint his dying body with the same oil that crowned Clovis, as if he could bribe God himself for a few more days, a few more hours to check the integrity of his web. He has cages, not for prisoners, but for advisors, suspended in rooms so he could speak to them without them ever getting within striking distance. This is the narrative of him, the man they called l'universelle araignée, the universal spider. And this final, grotesque scene presents the ultimate paradox of his reign. To understand this man, we must understand the core question his life poses. How did a king so universally feared and loathed, a ruler who trusted no one and was trusted by none, manage to spin a political web so intricate and so strong that it not only held the kingdom of France together, but continued to operate, to trap his enemies and empower his successors, long after the spider at its center had withered and died? This was the saga of Louis XI, a king who inherited not a kingdom, but a collection of scars held together by the thinnest of threads. To understand the spider, we must first understand the fractured world that created him, a world teetering on the brink of dissolution. The France of the mid-15th century was a ghost of a nation, a land haunted by the memory of a century of brutal warfare. The 100 Years' War against England had officially ended, but its poison remained. Vast swathes of the countryside were desolate, roamed by bands of ruthless mercenaries, the infamous écorcheurs, who knew no master and lived only for plunder. The authority of the French crown, so hard won by Louis's father, Charles VII, was a flickering candle in a gale. The true power in the realm did not reside in Paris, but in the mighty courts of the great feudal dukes, who ruled their domains as virtual kings. To the south, the Duke of Armagnac plotted with foreign powers. In the west, the proud Duke of Brittany saw himself as a sovereign, not a subject. But the greatest threat, the shadow that loomed over everything, was the colossal power of Burgundy. This was no mere duchy. It was a burgeoning empire stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps, a glittering civilization whose court, under Philip the Good, was the envy of all Christendom. It was a state built on a different model, one of chivalry, immense wealth from the wool trade in Flanders, and military might. And its heir, Charles the Bold, saw France not as his mother country, but as his primary rival. This was the chessboard Louis was born into, a weakened France, a patchwork quilt of competing loyalties, surrounded by predators. The king was not a supreme ruler, but merely the most powerful lord among a pack of wolves, each jealously guarding its own territory. The very idea of France as a single unified nation was a dream, not a reality. Louis's entire life would be a brutal, relentless war against this fragmentation, a desperate struggle to bind these disparate pieces together with threads of iron and intrigue before they spun apart forever. His reign was not just a quest for power, it was a race against oblivion. To understand this man, we must return to the world of his youth, a cold and loveless crucible that forged his singular character. He was the son of Charles VII, a king known as the Victorious, for having finally driven the English from France with the help of Joan of Arc. But victory did not make Charles a warm father. He was a distant, melancholic, and deeply suspicious man, forever scarred by the humiliations of his own youth when his legitimacy was questioned and his kingdom was nearly lost. He saw in his son, the Dauphin Louis, not an heir to be nurtured, but a rival to be watched. Louis grew up in the chilly halls of Loches and Chinon, starved of affection and steeped in an atmosphere of constant political maneuvering. His mother, Marie of Anjou, was pious but emotionally frail, unable to provide the warmth his father denied him. From his earliest days, Louis learned that survival depended not on love or loyalty, which were fleeting, but on calculation and secrecy. He saw firsthand how the great nobles of the realm paid lip service to the king while pursuing their own selfish ambitions. He witnessed the fragility of power, the ease with which alliances could be broken, and the brutal consequences of a single misstep. This childhood was his first and most important education. It taught him to listen more than he spoke, to mask his true intentions behind a veil of ambiguity, and to view every human relationship as a transaction. He developed an obsessive eye for detail, a prodigious memory for grievances, and a profound contempt for the romantic ideals of chivalry, which he saw as a foolish and dangerous affectation that blinded men like the Burgundians to the hard realities of power. His was a world without trust, and so he became a master of deceit, a prodigy of paranoia, whose mind was a fortress no one could enter. The father's coldness created a void that Louis would spend his entire life trying to fill, not with love or acceptance, but with the only thing he truly believed in: absolute, unshakable control. The first web the young spider ever spun was a clumsy, desperate thing, and its immediate collapse would become the most important lesson of his life. In 1440, at the age of 16, the Dauphin Louis became the figurehead of a major aristocratic rebellion against his own father. Known as the Praguerie, it was a confederation of the great dukes, men like the Duke of Bourbon and the Duke of Alençon, who felt their feudal powers were being curtailed by the centralizing reforms of King Charles VII. They saw in the ambitious and resentful Dauphin the perfect tool to advance their cause. Louis, for his part, was impatient. He chafed under his father's authority and yearned to rule, believing he could govern France far better than the king he saw as indecisive and overly reliant on unworthy advisors. He threw himself into the conspiracy, lending it his royal prestige and becoming its symbolic leader. But he had fundamentally miscalculated. He underestimated his father's resolve and overestimated the loyalty of his noble allies. Charles VII reacted with uncharacteristic speed and determination, raising a royal army and methodically crushing the rebellion. The great lords, seeing the tide turn, quickly abandoned their young puppet and scrambled to make peace with the king. Louis was left isolated, humiliated, and utterly defeated. Forced to beg for his father's forgiveness at Cusset, he was met not with rage, but with a cold, contemptuous pardon that was, in its own way, far more punishing. This public humiliation was a formative trauma. It burned into his soul a series of vital lessons. Never trust the promises of the great nobility, for their only loyalty is to themselves. Never launch an attack until your opponent's weaknesses have been thoroughly exploited, and your own victory is all but certain. And most importantly, never, ever again engage in open, direct confrontation. The Praguerie taught him that the glorious charge of the knight was a fool's gambit. The true path to victory lay in the shadows, in the patient work of sowing discord, funding your enemy's enemies, and waiting calmly for them to destroy themselves. He had tried to be a lion and failed. From that day forward, he would learn to be a spider. Behind the cold calculus and the ceaseless plotting, a single, powerful emotion drove Louis XI with the force of an obsession, a deep, visceral fear of chaos. This was his inner demon, the secret motivation that animated every decision of his long and complex reign. He was not a sadist who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake, nor was he motivated by simple greed. His ambition was for something far greater and more abstract, the imposition of a perfect, suffocating, and absolute order upon the fractured kingdom of France. His childhood had been a lesson in fragmentation. He had seen the kingdom nearly devoured by the English, torn apart by the private wars of arrogant nobles, and bled dry by lawless mercenaries. He saw France not as a glorious nation, but as a fragile entity perpetually on the verge of disintegration. This terror of dissolution became the core of his political philosophy. He believed that the centrifugal forces of feudalism, the ancient rights, the local loyalties, the personal ambitions of the dukes and barons, were a cancer that would inevitably kill the kingdom if not ruthlessly excised. In his mind, the only cure was the crown. Absolute, centralized power, wielded by a single unyielding will, was not a form of tyranny, but a precondition for survival. This is why he fought the nobility with such relentless and unforgiving ferocity. He saw their calls for the public weal as a transparently cynical cover for their desire to return to the profitable chaos of a weak monarchy. Every intrigue he spun, every tax he levied, every enemy he secretly funded, was a means to this one ultimate end: to break the power of the aristocracy and forge a new France where all threads of authority led back to a single point: the king. This obsessive need for control explains both his greatest achievements and his most monstrous cruelties. He built the modern state, but he did so by crushing dissent, imprisoning opponents in iron cages, and pursuing his enemies with a paranoia that bordered on madness. He was not just a king, he was a political ideologue, a fanatic for the religion of order, and he was willing to sacrifice anything, honor, morality, and countless human lives, on its altar. The final, crucial element in the forging of the Spider King was his long and bitter apprenticeship in the very heart of his enemy's territory. After the humiliation of the Praguerie, the Dauphin's relationship with his father, King Charles, deteriorated completely. Fearing for his life, Louis fled France in 1456 and sought refuge at the court of the most powerful man in Europe, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. For 5 years, he lived as an exile in Brussels and Genappe, a political refugee entirely dependent on the charity of his father's greatest rival. This was a period of profound personal humiliation, but it was also the most important political education he would ever receive. He was a poor, shabbily dressed prince living in the most opulent and extravagant court of the age. While the Burgundian nobility, clad in silks and jewels, engaged in magnificent tournaments and feasts, Louis watched. He observed the immense wealth of the duchy, derived from the booming commercial centers of Flanders. He studied its complex administrative machinery, its military organization, and, most importantly, its inherent weaknesses. He saw that its vast territories were a patchwork of different peoples with different languages and loyalties, held together only by the personal authority of the Duke. And it was here that he formed the defining relationship of his life, his rivalry with the Duke's son and heir, the young and impetuous Charles, Count of Charolais, who would later be known to history as Charles the Bold. The two men were polar opposites. Charles was the embodiment of the chivalric ideal, tall, handsome, obsessed with military glory, and utterly transparent in his ambitions. Louis was cunning, physically unimpressive, and believed that battles were a crude and inefficient way to achieve one's goals. During his exile, Louis studied his future adversary with the cold, detached curiosity of a naturalist observing an insect. He learned what fueled Charles's pride, what stoked his famous rage, and what his ultimate ambitions were. This long, unwilling apprenticeship gave Louis an unparalleled insight into the mind of his enemy and the structure of his state. When he finally returned to France as king in 1461, he was not just fighting Burgundy. He was fighting a man whose soul he knew intimately, and a system whose every flaw he had committed to memory. Upon ascending the throne of France in 1461, following the death of his estranged father, Louis XI did not pause for breath. He unleashed a whirlwind of activity that immediately signaled a radical break with the past and horrified the established order. His first acts were not ones of reconciliation, but of brutal and calculated revolution. He immediately dismissed the trusted and experienced counselors who had served his father for decades, men who had helped win the 100 Years' War, replacing them with a new class of administrators, lawyers, merchants, and minor gentry, men of talent whose loyalty was not to the old feudal order, but solely to him, their patron. This was a direct assault on the great families who had always seen the royal council as their exclusive domain. Simultaneously, he struck at their wallets. To fund his ambitions for a standing army and a centralized state, he imposed a series of heavy taxes, overriding the complex web of local customs and noble exemptions that had always constrained the French monarchy's finances. He revoked hunting rights, a cherished privilege of the aristocracy, and began reclaiming royal lands that had been granted away to powerful lords. To the great dukes and counts of France, these actions were not just policy changes, they were a declaration of war. They saw a king who did not respect tradition, who did not consult with his natural advisors, and who was intent on systematically dismantling the very foundations of their power. Within 4 years of his coronation, Louis had managed to unite virtually the entire French nobility against him. He had acted with the speed and subtlety of a thunderclap, believing that a swift, decisive display of royal authority would cow his subjects into submission. Instead, he had merely succeeded in creating a vast and powerful coalition of sworn enemies, proving that the price of the crown would be a kingdom-wide civil war. He had seized power, but in his haste, he had isolated himself completely. The spider was on the throne, but his web was, for now, perilously small. The response from the outraged nobility was swift, and it took the form of a grand and terrifying antagonist, the League of the Public Weal. In 1465, the great feudal lords of France, who had chafed under Louis's autocratic reforms, put aside their own rivalries to form a massive military alliance with a single, declared aim: to curb the power of the tyrannical king. This was not a foreign invasion, but something far more dangerous, a civil war that pitted the crown against its most powerful subjects. The League was a who's who of the French aristocracy, including the king's own brother, Charles, Duke of Berry, the cunning Francis II of Brittany, and the aged, but respected, Duke of Bourbon. But its undisputed military leader, the heart and soul of the rebellion, was Louis's lifelong nemesis, Charles the Bold, then the Count of Charolais, acting on behalf of his aging father, the Duke of Burgundy. The name League of the Public Weal was a masterful piece of propaganda, framing their rebellion not as a selfish grasp for power, but as a noble crusade to restore justice and good governance to a kingdom oppressed by a despotic monarch. They issued manifestos denouncing the king's low-born advisors and his illegal taxes, winning significant popular support. This conflict represented the fundamental struggle for the future of France. On one side stood the forces of feudal fragmentation, the vision of a kingdom where power was decentralized, and the king was merely the first among equals. On the other side stood Louis XI, the champion of royal absolutism, who believed that France could only survive if it was united under a single, unquestionable authority. The decisive, bloody, and utterly inconclusive Battle of Montlhéry was a microcosm of the entire conflict. Both sides claimed victory, but neither could land a knockout blow. The war was a brutal stalemate, forcing Louis to the negotiating table and demonstrating that the Spider could not simply crush his enemies with force. He would have to find another way. In the intricate high-stakes game of diplomacy and intrigue, even the most brilliant player can make a catastrophic blunder. For Louis, that moment of fatal miscalculation came in October of 1468, an episode that would become a legendary tale of royal humiliation, the interview at Péronne. Believing in the supreme power of his own intellect and his ability to persuade any man in a face-to-face meeting, Louis took an extraordinary gamble. He decided to negotiate directly with his most formidable adversary, Charles the Bold, who by now had become the Duke of Burgundy. Against the strenuous advice of his counselors, Louis traveled with a small escort to Charles's castle at Péronne, placing himself entirely at his enemy's mercy. He intended to use his silver tongue and promises of concessions to detach Charles from his alliance with the Duke of Brittany. However, the Spider had walked willingly into the lion's den, and he had forgotten about a web of his own making. Just as the negotiations began, news arrived that the city of Liège, a protectorate of Burgundy, had risen in violent rebellion against the Duke. The revolt had been secretly incited and funded for months by Louis's own agents. The timing could not have been worse. Charles the Bold flew into a legendary rage. He saw the King of France not as a guest for a parley, but as a treacherous schemer caught red-handed. He immediately imprisoned Louis within the castle, and for 3 terrifying days, the King of France was the Duke of Burgundy's captive. The historical irony was crushing. Louis was held in a tower where, centuries earlier, a French king had imprisoned a rebellious vassal. Now, the roles were reversed. Under threat of death or perpetual imprisonment, Louis was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Péronne, granting massive concessions to Burgundy. But the ultimate degradation was yet to come. Charles forced Louis to accompany the Burgundian army to Liège and to witness, as a powerless accomplice, the brutal and bloody sack of the very city he had encouraged to rebel. The experience at Péronne seared a permanent lesson into Louis's soul. Never again would he place his physical person in a position of vulnerability. Cunning and diplomacy were his greatest weapons, but they were useless when he was looking at the world through the bars of a cage. Having learned the brutal lesson of Péronne, Louis XI refined his strategy. If direct confrontation and personal diplomacy were fraught with peril, he would perfect the art of indirect warfare, becoming a master puppeteer who made his enemies dance on strings they could not see. His greatest theater of operations for this new kind of war was England, a kingdom conveniently tearing itself apart in the dynastic struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. Louis saw the conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York not as a foreign problem, but as a golden opportunity. His arch-rival, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, was strongly allied with the Yorkist king, Edward IV, having married Edward's sister, Margaret of York. A stable, powerful Yorkist England represented an existential threat to France, as it could open a second front in any future war with Burgundy. So, Louis set about methodically turning England's internal chaos into his shield. When the Lancastrian cause seemed lost, he provided refuge and funds to the exiled Queen Margaret of Anjou and her son. His true masterpiece, however, was his manipulation of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. When Warwick, the man who had put Edward IV on the throne, had a falling out with his king, Louis saw his chance. In a stunning piece of subtle diplomacy, he brokered an impossible alliance between his two sworn English enemies, the exiled Lancastrian Queen Margaret and the disgruntled Yorkist Kingmaker. He funded Warwick's audacious invasion of England in 1470, which successfully, albeit temporarily, overthrew Edward IV and restored the Lancastrian Henry VI to the throne. The gambit ultimately failed, and Warwick was killed the following year. But for Louis, the outcome was a strategic triumph. For a crucial period, he had neutralized the English threat completely, forcing Charles the Bold to divert resources and attention to his English allies, and preventing a joint Anglo-Burgundian invasion of France. He had used English gold, English soldiers, and English blood as a weapon, weakening two of his enemies at once without sacrificing a single French soldier. It was the spider's strategy perfected, turning the chaos on his periphery into a protective wall for his own kingdom. The central obsession of Louis XI's reign, the culmination of all his schemes, and the goal of every thread he spun, was the utter destruction of the great Burgundian state. His final victory over Charles the Bold was not a single, glorious event, but a slow, methodical, and pitiless process of strangulation, a triumph of strategy so complete that Louis barely had to draw his own sword. He understood that to fight Charles the Bold on his own terms, in a grand, chivalric battle, was to play to his enemy's strengths. Charles was a magnificent warrior, but a disastrous politician. Louis, therefore, refused to fight him. Instead, he waged a new kind of war, a war of attrition, diplomacy, and subversion. He became the architect of a grand anti-Burgundian coalition, a web of alliances that would slowly encircle and suffocate his rival. His most crucial move was to identify Charles's other enemies. He poured immense sums of French gold into the coffers of the Swiss Confederacy, whose formidable pikemen were the finest infantry in Europe, and who viewed Burgundian expansion with growing alarm. He signed a treaty with the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, turning another potential Burgundian ally into a foe. He stirred up dissent within Charles's own territories, encouraging towns in Alsace and Lorraine to rebel against the Duke's heavy-handed rule. Charles, blinded by his dreams of forging a new kingdom between France and Germany, walked into every trap Louis laid. He became fixated on conquering the stubborn Swiss, pouring his resources into a series of disastrous campaigns. While Louis watched patiently from a distance, the Burgundian army, the most feared military machine of its age, was systematically dismantled. Charles was defeated at Grandson in 1476, then routed at Merton months later. The final act came on January 5, 1477, at the Battle of Nancy. Charles, in a desperate final gamble, laid siege to the city. The Swiss army, funded by Louis's money, arrived to relieve it. The battle was a massacre. Charles the Bold was killed, his body found days later, half-eaten by wolves, frozen in a pond. The mighty state of Burgundy, the great rival of France for a century, died with him. Louis had won the defining struggle of his era without a single major French army ever engaging the enemy. He had simply bought the weapons for others to use and patiently waited for his rival's arrogance to deliver the fatal blow. The news of Charles the Bold's death at Nancy reached the court of Louis XI, not with the ringing of bells and triumphant parades, but with a quiet, almost unnerving stillness. There was no grand celebration, no public display of joy from the king. Instead, those who observed him noted a chillingly calm, deeply focused satisfaction. This was the psychology of the spider who has finally seen the mighty wasp, after buzzing and threatening for so long, fall motionless into his web. Louis's reaction was not one of elation, but of profound validation. For him, this was not a stroke of luck or a mere military victory. It was the definitive proof of his entire philosophy of power. It was the triumph of the mind over the body, of patience over impetuosity, of gold over steel. For years, the courts of Europe had mocked Louis's drab clothing, his secretive ways, and his refusal to engage in the glorious theater of chivalric warfare. Charles, by contrast, had been lauded as the perfect knight, the embodiment of martial valor. And now, Charles lay dead in a frozen ditch, his dreams of a kingdom turned to ice, while Louis, the shabby intriguer, sat in his study, master of the field. This moment cemented in Louis's mind an almost messianic belief in his own cunning. He saw the outcome not as the result of Swiss bravery, but as the flawless execution of his own grand design. His hubris, which had always been considerable, now became absolute. He believed he could outwit any opponent, solve any problem, and bend history itself to his will through the sheer force of his intellect. This cold, analytical triumph, devoid of passion, marked a turning point. It was the moment he stopped being just a king fighting for survival and became something more dangerous, a political engineer who believed he had discovered the infallible laws of power, a man convinced that the entire world was simply a complex machine that he, and he alone, knew how to operate. The epic, decades-long struggle between Louis XI and Charles the Bold was more than just a rivalry between two men. It was a clash of civilizations, a symbolic war between the dying medieval world and the ruthless dawn of the modern era. Charles was the last and most magnificent embodiment of the chivalric ideal. He was obsessed with the pageantry of knighthood, dreaming of crusades and legendary heroes like Alexander the Great and Hannibal. He lived his life by a code of personal honor, courage on the battlefield, and glorious ambition. He saw power as something to be seized in a magnificent, head-on charge, his armor gleaming, his banner flying. He built the most splendid court in Europe, a monument to the aristocratic, martial values of the feudal age. Louis, his sworn enemy, was the antithesis of all of this. He was the king of the New Age, a man who saw chivalry as a dangerous and expensive theatrical performance. He famously wore drab, cheap woolen clothes, not out of humility, but as a deliberate rejection of the courtly extravagance he saw as a weakness in his rival. While Charles fought with lances and broadswords, Louis fought with espionage, economic warfare, and diplomatic encirclement. He believed that every man had a price, and that a bag of gold delivered to the right person could achieve more than 1,000 knights. Charles was direct, passionate, and prone to towering rages. Louis was indirect, calculating, and endlessly patient. Their personal duel was a perfect microcosm of their strategic philosophies. Charles sought to build a new kingdom in the center of Europe through open conquest. Louis sought to consolidate the Kingdom of France by working from the inside, breaking the power of his vassals and centralizing the state apparatus. In the end, the patient spider's victory was absolute. Charles's death at Nancy was not just the death of a man, it was the death of an idea. It was the moment the world of knights and honor was decisively defeated by the world of spies, bankers, and bureaucrats. The future did not belong to the lion, it belonged to the spider. While Louis XI was waging his shadow war against the great feudal lords, he was simultaneously engaged in a far less dramatic, but ultimately more revolutionary project: the construction of the modern French state. His genius lay in understanding that true, lasting power came not from personal authority, which dies with the king, but from impersonal institutions that would endure long after he was gone. He was the kingdom's great, tireless weaver, creating a new skeleton of administrative and economic power that would bind France together. His most famous innovation was the creation of the Royal Postal Service in 1477. On the surface, it was designed to speed up official communication, but its true purpose was to be the central nervous system of his intelligence network. He established postal relays on all the major roads of France, with horses ready at all times, allowing his messengers and his spies to travel with unprecedented speed. He now had the best information network in Europe, a weapon more powerful than any army. Simultaneously, he revolutionized the kingdom's finances. He solidified the toil, a direct tax, as a permanent and royal prerogative, removing the need to constantly beg his vassals for funds. This gave the crown a steady, predictable stream of revenue, allowing him to maintain the first professional, standing army in Europe, an army loyal only to him, the man who paid their wages, not to some local duke. But his vision extended beyond the military and administrative. He was a master of economic warfare and development, understanding that national wealth was a cornerstone of national power. He heavily subsidized the creation of a domestic silk industry in Lyon to compete with the Italian city-states, and he actively encouraged the new technology of the printing press, recognizing its power to disseminate information and royal propaganda. Each of these reforms was a thread in his grand web, designed to bypass the feudal nobility and create a direct link between the king and the kingdom. He was building a machine of state, a bureaucracy that would outlive him and ensure that the power he had so brutally accumulated would not dissipate after his death. In his public life, Louis XI was a figure of cold, rational calculation, a king who seemed to subordinate all human feeling to the needs of the state. But in his private life, he was a man of bizarre and profound contradictions, a figure who seemed to straddle the line between the modern pragmatist and the medieval mystic. His court was famously austere, a stark contrast to the opulence of Burgundy. He dressed like a provincial merchant, in a coarse gray coat and an old felt hat, a deliberate affectation that both advertised his thriftiness and showed his contempt for aristocratic pomp. His marriage to his second wife, Charlotte of Savoy, was a model of cold neglect. He kept her and the royal children, for the most part, isolated in the Chateau of Amboise, visiting them rarely. He valued his family not for love, but for their dynastic utility. Yet, he placed an extraordinary degree of trust in his eldest daughter, Anne of Beaujeu, recognizing in her a political intellect that mirrored his own. This cold pragmatism coexisted with a deep, almost pathological piety. He was intensely devout, endowing churches and collecting relics with a feverish passion. He made a pilgrimage to nearly every major shrine in his kingdom. But his faith was strange and transactional. He prayed to the Virgin Mary and the saints as if they were powerful feudal lords whose favor could be bought with lavish gifts and carefully worded contracts. He would promise a silver railing for a shrine in exchange for a victory, or name a saint as an admiral in the French Navy. This piety was fused with a profound superstition. He surrounded himself with astrologers, most famously the Italian Galeotto Marzio, and would consult the stars before making any major decision. He was a man who patronized the printing press, but feared the wrath of God, a king who built a modern state, but believed his destiny was written in the heavens. These contradictions were the key to his character, a man with a foot in two different worlds, using the ruthless logic of the dawning Renaissance to achieve his goals, while still living in the enchanted and terrifying spiritual universe of the Middle Ages. As the 1480s dawned, the great spider could look upon his work with satisfaction. His lifelong rival, Charles the Bold, was dead. The Duchy of Burgundy was shattered and absorbed into the French crown. The great feudal lords were either dead, exiled, or cowed into submission. The kingdom was at peace, the royal treasury was full, and the machinery of his new, centralized state was running smoothly. From the outside, Louis XI was at the absolute zenith of his power. But inside, the first tremors of the end were beginning. The king's body, never robust, began to betray him. In 1481, he suffered the first of a series of debilitating strokes. The attack left him temporarily speechless and partially paralyzed, a terrifying experience for a man whose entire life was predicated on absolute self-control. For the first time, he was confronted with an enemy he could not outwit, bribe, or destroy: his own mortality. The decline of his physical health unleashed a tidal wave of paranoia that had always lurked beneath his calculating surface. His fear of assassination, always present, now became an all-consuming obsession. He transformed his favorite residence, the Château de Plessis-les-Tours near Tours, into a veritable fortress, a prison of his own making. He surrounded it with a triple wall, topped with iron spikes. A garrison of his loyal Scottish Guard patrolled the grounds day and night, with crossbowmen stationed in iron watchtowers. He slept in a different, heavily barred room each night. The stories that emerged from Plessis were gothic and bizarre. Tales of man-traps and spring guns hidden in the gardens, of summary executions for unauthorized trespassers, and of the king himself, a shambling, suspicious figure, shuffling through the dark corridors, seeing enemies in every shadow. The master of a vast and powerful kingdom had shrunk his own world to the size of a fortified castle. He had defeated all his external foes, only to be conquered by the enemies within: the fear of death and the decay of his own body. The great web had secured the kingdom, but the spider at its center was beginning to unravel. In his final years, as his body failed and his paranoia intensified, Louis XI turned his formidable intellect to the last and most important problem of his reign: securing his legacy. This was the final, critical gambit, the move on the chessboard that would determine whether his entire life's work would endure or crumble into dust upon his death. He knew his heir, the Dauphin Charles, was a boy of 13, physically frail, and, in Louis's estimation, intellectually weak. To simply hand over the reins of power to a council of the great nobles, the traditional solution, was unthinkable. It would be entrusting the sheepfold to the wolves he had spent his entire life caging. It would undo everything. He needed a successor who was not just loyal, but who was a true extension of his own will, a mind as cunning, as ruthless, and as dedicated to the absolute power of the crown as he was. He found that successor in the most unlikely of places, not in a son, not in a powerful duke, but in his own daughter, Anne of France. In an act that shattered centuries of precedent and flew in the face of the misogynistic traditions of the age, Louis meticulously prepared Anne to rule. In his final months, he dictated his last instructions to her, schooling her in the art of governance, revealing his secrets of statecraft, and outlining his vision for the future. Then, in his will, and on his deathbed, he made his fateful decision. He did not name a man as regent. He did not name a council. He entrusted the Kingdom of France and the guardianship of his young son, King Charles VIII, to the sole authority of his 22-year-old daughter. He made Anne of Beaujeu, as she was known by her marriage, the de facto ruler of the most powerful kingdom in Europe. It was his ultimate act of pragmatism, a final testament to his belief that intellect and ability, not gender or tradition, were the only things that mattered in the brutal game of power. He was placing his entire legacy into the hands of a young woman, gambling that her mind, which he had personally forged, was the strongest thread in his entire web. The final years of Louis XI represent one of history's most profound and disturbing paradoxes: the all-powerful monarch as a terrified prisoner. The man who had broken the mightiest dukes of Christendom became a slave to his own fear. His self-imposed incarceration at Plessis-les-Tours was not just a security measure. It was a psychological catastrophe, the logical endpoint of a life built on suspicion. The universal spider, who had spun webs across all of Europe, now found himself trapped in the very center of his own most intricate creation, a web of pure terror. The contemporary chronicler, Philippe de Comines, who knew him well, paints a chilling portrait of these last days. The king, ravaged by strokes, his face pale and his body emaciated, would hide himself away, refusing to be seen by almost anyone, lest they witness his decay and be emboldened to rebel. He lived in mortal fear of the word death, and punished any courtier who dared utter it in his presence. His paranoia extended to every aspect of his life. He wore heavy, padded clothes even in summer, convinced they could deflect a dagger's thrust. He had his food prepared in a sealed kitchen and tasted by a legion of servants. Yet, this terrified, decaying man was still the absolute ruler of France. His mind, though plagued by fear, remained sharp and cruel. From his fortified chamber, he continued to micromanage the kingdom. He dispatched spies, signed death warrants, and conducted foreign policy with a relentless energy that defied his physical collapse. This schism between his absolute political power and his profound personal terror created a grotesque spectacle. He who had caged his enemies in iron cells now lived in a cage of his own design, a fortress not against an invading army, but against the specter of his own mortality. He had successfully controlled the world outside, but had been utterly consumed by the chaos within. The king in the iron cage was the final, tragic image of a man who had gained a kingdom but lost himself in the labyrinthine darkness of his own mind. In the final, flickering moments of his life, the defining characteristics of Louis XI's reign, his obsessive control, his transactional piety, and his unyielding will, were magnified to a fever pitch. As the last days of August 1483 ticked away, the atmosphere at Plessis-les-Tours was one of frantic, desperate activity, all centered on the dying king's bedchamber. His body was failing, but his mind refused to surrender its grip. Couriers still galloped in and out of the fortress, carrying orders that decided the fates of men and the policies of the kingdom. Even as he struggled for breath, he was dictating letters, confirming appointments, and demanding reports from his captains and spies. He was a general conducting a war from his stretcher, refusing to concede defeat to the final enemy. Simultaneously, he waged a parallel campaign to bargain with heaven. His agents scoured Europe for holy relics, paying astronomical sums for the bones of saints and fragments of the true cross. His most desperate gambit was to summon a humble and revered hermit from Calabria, a man known today as Saint Francis of Paula. Louis believed that this holy man, through his prayers, could perform a miracle and extend his life. He fell before the hermit, the feared King of France, begging a penniless friar for more time, promising him anything, any amount of gold, any number of new monasteries, in exchange for a stay of execution from God. But his attempts to bribe God were as futile as his fortresses were against the advance of disease. On the 25th of August, a final massive stroke silenced him forever. For 5 days he lay speechless and motionless, a living corpse. The ceaseless activity he had orchestrated for decades ground to a halt. The couriers stopped, the secretaries put down their pens, and the court held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The mind that had been the central engine of France for 22 years had finally gone silent. The web, for the first time, was without its spider. On the 30th of August, 1483, the final thread was cut. Louis XI, King of France, drew his last breath. He died not in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, like his rival Charles the Bold, nor at the hands of an assassin, the end he had so long feared. He died in his bed, defeated by the slow, inexorable decay of his own body. The moment of his death was met not with an outpouring of grief, but with a profound and stunned silence, followed by a collective sigh of relief that echoed across the entire kingdom. The frantic, nervous energy that had radiated from Plessis-les-Tours and kept all of France in a state of perpetual tension for 2 decades suddenly dissipated. The guards on the walls could finally relax their watch. The nobles in their distant castles could finally speak without looking over their shoulders. The ministers and secretaries who had trembled before his every command could finally breathe. For 22 years, France had been governed by the will of one man, a will so powerful and so intrusive that it had reached into every corner of the realm. Now, that will was extinguished. The spider was dead. The silence that followed was one of uncertainty and apprehension. Had he built a structure that could stand on its own, or was the entire edifice of the French state merely a reflection of his personal power, destined to collapse without him? His enemies certainly hoped for the latter, seeing in his death the opportunity to reclaim their lost powers and plunge the kingdom back into the familiar, profitable chaos of feudal strife. The great question hung in the air. Was this the end of the web, or merely the death of the weaver? The king's body was sent for burial at the Basilica of Notre-Dame de Cléry, a church he himself had lavishly endowed, a final, transactional payment to his preferred saint. But his true legacy would not be interred with his bones. It was alive, a vast and complex network of power, waiting to see if it would hold. The legacy of Louis XI was, from the moment of his death, a subject of furious and irreconcilable conflict. There was no single, agreed-upon verdict on his reign. Instead, his memory was immediately torn between 2 opposing narratives, each championed by those whose lives he had profoundly altered. To the great feudal nobility, the houses of Armagnac, Bourbon, and the remnants of the Burgundian party, he was, and would always be, le tyran. He was the universal spider, a malevolent and duplicitous despot who had trampled on their ancient and sacred rights, who had governed through fear, and who had replaced the noble traditions of personal loyalty with a cold, impersonal bureaucracy of low-born clerks and lawyers. They remembered the iron cages, the summary executions, and the relentless, suffocating pressure he had applied to break their independence. In their eyes, he had degraded the kingdom, replacing the honorable code of chivalry with the immoral calculus of the counting house. But for another, rising class of people, his legacy was entirely different. To the merchants of Lyon, the bankers of Paris, and the small landowners of the provinces, Louis was a hero. He was the king who had brought peace. He had crushed the arrogant nobles whose private wars had devastated the countryside for generations. He had secured the roads, stabilized the currency, and encouraged trade. He was the bringer of order, the strong hand that had disciplined the aristocratic predators and allowed ordinary people to prosper. To the architects of the modern state, the jurists, the administrators, the professional soldiers, he was nothing less than the founder of modern France. He was the visionary who had forged a fragmented collection of feudal territories into a unified, centralized nation. This fundamental conflict of interpretations defined his place in history. He was either the cruel tyrant who destroyed the liberties of the old world or the brilliant statesman who built the foundations of the new. He was both, of course, and it is in this irresolvable paradox that his true historical significance lies. We now arrive at the final, comprehensive answer to the core question that has haunted our narrative. Why did the webs of the spider of France continue to operate even after his death? The answer is that Louis XI, unlike his predecessors, did not build a kingdom based on the shifting sands of personal loyalty. He built a machine. His webs outlived him because they were not spun from the delicate, easily broken threads of feudal obligation. They were forged from the cold, hard iron of modern institutions. First, he created a permanent, professional army, paid directly from the royal treasury. These soldiers were loyal to the state, the source of their income, not to some local baron. This deprived the nobility of their traditional military power and gave his successors a tool of coercion that was loyal to the crown alone. Second, he perfected a centralized and brutally efficient tax system that bypassed the nobles entirely, giving the monarchy financial independence and immense power. This river of gold, flowing directly to Paris, was the lifeblood of the new state, funding its army, its bureaucracy, and its ambitions. Third, his postal system was more than just a way to deliver mail. It was a national intelligence agency, a nervous system that allowed the central government to monitor events, anticipate threats, and project its power into the furthest corners of the kingdom. But his ultimate and most brilliant posthumous act was the creation of his successor. In choosing his daughter, Anne of Beaujeu, as regent, he ensured that his own mind would continue to rule France. Anne had been his student. She understood his methods, shared his goals, and possessed his same unsentimental, calculating intellect. For the next 8 years, during the regency known as the Mad War, she would brilliantly defend her father's legacy, defeating a final, massive aristocratic rebellion and completing his work of consolidating royal power. Louis's webs held because he had bequeathed to France not just a king, but a system, a self-perpetuating apparatus of financial, military, and administrative control, captained by a hand-picked successor who was the perfect instrument of his undying will. The life of Louis XI represents a profound and universal lesson on the nature of power and the birth of the modern world. His reign was the historical moment when the curtain fell on the age of chivalry and rose on the age of the state. He was the great destroyer of the medieval ideal, the world of knights in shining armor, of sacred oaths and glorious combat, dissolved in the acid of his pragmatism. He taught Europe a brutal lesson, that a well-placed spy is worth more than 1,000 lances, that a subsidy to an enemy's enemy is more effective than a declaration of war, and that a centralized bureaucracy can defeat the most powerful feudal army. His life demonstrates the ultimate victory of intellect over inherited status, of calculation over courage. He was the triumph of the administrator over the warrior. But his story is also a darker fable about the price of that modernity. He built a strong, unified France, but he did so through methods that were often monstrously cruel. He brought peace and order, but at the cost of liberty, at least for the aristocratic class he so ruthlessly suppressed. He embodies the essential paradox of the modern nation-state. Its capacity for creating stability is inextricably linked to its capacity for exercising immense, often terrifying, control. Louis was the first king to truly grasp that a kingdom is not a personal domain, but an abstract entity, the state, with its own logic, its own interests, and its own ruthless morality that transcends the lives of individuals, even that of the king himself. He was not just the king of France, he was its first servant and also its first tyrant, sacrificing both his enemies and himself to the unforgiving idol of the centralized state. His ultimate legacy is the world we now inhabit, a world governed by impersonal institutions, national interests, and the cold, hard logic of power he helped to invent. And so, we are left with the final, enduring image. The universal spider is long dead. His body has turned to dust in its tomb at Clery. The man, with all his fears, his superstitions, and his strange genius, is gone. But his creation, the web, remains. It is a vast and intricate structure, no longer dependent on the creature who spun it. Its threads are the roads and rivers of France, the institutions of its government, the flow of its commerce, and the reach of its armies. The web is the nation itself, a single, unified entity, where before there had been only a collection of disparate, warring fiefdoms. It glistens in the dawn of a new era, the Renaissance, an age that Louis, in his own dark and bloody fashion, helped to bring into being. The web is strong, resilient, and it continues to serve its primary purpose: to draw power from the periphery to the center, to trap the unwary who challenge the authority of the state, and to provide the structure upon which the future glories and tragedies of France will be built. This was the ultimate victory of Louis XI. He achieved a kind of immortality, not by bribing God or conquering the world, but by weaving a system so powerful and so logical that it no longer required his presence. The shadow of the Spider King looms long over the history of France, a silent testament to the man who understood that true power is not held, but constructed.